And joining me right now here on the Mark Moses Show on the Anidjar and Levine, studios is one of my good friends, and he works with the Tampa Bay Rays radio network. He's my great friend, play-by-play man, and probably 50 other jobs. Yes, Neil Solondz. Neil, how you doing today?
Good. How are you, Mark? Thanks for having me on.
Hey, always appreciate you coming on, and I know it's been a minute. For our listeners and our viewers, how long have you been working for the organization now?
So this is year 14 overall, third in the play-by-play chair with Andy Freed. And I can't imagine a better organization to work for, just in terms of the way they treat their people, and the way they do things and on a day-by-day basis.
You're absolutely right. And I know this season has probably been maybe the most interesting. I'm trying to look at what's the word to use. Because if we go back to last fall, there's damage to the Trop. You don't know where you're going to play. Now you're there in Tampa. What was that like last fall for you and all of your coworkers, where you don't even know where you're going to play baseball in 25?
I think first and foremost, when everything happened, you were worried about the physical health of yourself, your families, everyone around you. We at the time evacuated because of the area that we were in to the east coast of Florida, and we're very, very fortunate that the damage that we had, comparably speaking, was minimal. I had coworkers who were 6 months out of their homes before they got back in on a full-time basis, and so I think that was kind of the first and foremost thing that and there's still probably plenty of fans in our region who are still dealing with the damage and the remnants from both Helene and Milton. And then I think as we went, it was okay. Now what? How do we figure what's next going forward? And fortunately, our front office came together with what I think was the best possible plan, which is keeping us in the region where our fans could get to see us still on a day-by-day basis while you figure out the next steps. And we ended up in the largest outdoor facility that we could, which allowed as many fans as possible to see us. And I think they made it a seamless transition for what I think for most organizations would be quite challenging.
What is the update? And everyone asks me this question, so I'm going to go to the guy with the Rays shirt on who works for the organization. Okay, so this year we're in Tampa. What's the latest update where we're going to be at moving forward then?
So the city is responsible for the repairs of Tropicana Field, and they have worked with the Rays in Major League Baseball. The expectation is that we'll be back there at the start of next season. Now, who knows what, as we're just starting the hurricane season. So, who knows how that might impact 2026. But, at this point, we're kind of, as a broadcaster, I worry about the day by day and this 2025 season. But everything I've been told is we'll be ready for 2026. And I'm looking forward to, being back in our old building and what has been home to us for before this year, it was 13 years for myself, and more than a quarter century for some employees in that building.
I know you have a very nice family. I follow you on Facebook all the time. I know that's your number one home, but isn't the Trop also one of your homes? You worked there so long. I know it must have hurt you seeing that.
It did. It hurt a lot of us. I mean, the people you see on a regular basis, you have multiple families. You have your family at home, my wife and my my two girls, and but you also have your family in baseball because you're with them. We joke about it, but we're there with our broadcast family as much as we are our actual wives at home. During the 6-7 months of the season. So that's how we become close as a group and as a unit, and that's why sometimes we have events offsite in the off season to get together because we are so close. So and there are some of those folks who we don't see, some of the game day employees. Some of them are in Tampa at Steinbrenner Field, and some of them did not make the trek across the bay, and we hope to be reunited next year with them.
We're Neil Solondz, Tampa Bay Rays Radio Network. All right, you played there for a couple months, but what's it like broadcasting a game from Steinbrenner Field for regular season games?
Having spent 12 years at the minor league level before joining the Rays, and now with 20 some odd years in professional baseball, to me, a booth is a booth, and your job is your job, which is to best describe the action on radio to people who can't see it. And It's certainly different being outdoors. The other day was one of the few rain delays we've had. We've been very, very fortunate. They front loaded the schedule, so we're playing more home games early and more road games late to try and avoid some of the nasty weather you can get in this area. And, I think our staff has done an amazing job, keeping the field ready, handling the operations side of things. And, and I think, the energy in the building has been good. It's obviously different being outside. And it was great in April when it was 75 degrees and 80 degrees and sunny at night. Now it starts to pick up in heat and humidity, but that's part of it. And we knew that going in. And I think the biggest thing is our players have gotten better as the season has gone on. And I think they've adjusted to it really, really well. And it started to become more of a home field edge when we're home.
Okay, so if you look at the second half of the schedule, do the Rays have to become road warriors because of that?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, so far they've started over 500 on the road. They're 2 over 500 as we speak, at 500 at home, having won 8 of the last 10 at home, and 2 games over 500 away from home. If you end up, I always say, if you end up winning 2/3 of your home games or close to that, and you play 500 ball on the road, you're going to end up in the postseason more years than not. So, I hope that we get to that point, because I do think if healthy, this group is good enough to not only be in the race, but get in the postseason for the 6th time in 7 years.
Okay, talking to the players, and you do this daily, what has their thoughts been so far? I mean, pitching, hitting in that stadium as they're home for this season.
Well, I think it's varied because the conditions have changed. There have been the one thing that's probably different from a baseball standpoint is that because it's a minor league ballpark, there's not a second or third deck. And a lot of times if you're at a major league ballpark, especially outdoors, the wind will be mitigated by the second and third deck to a degree, because it doesn't penetrate that area of the ballpark as much because of the size of the building and the height of the building. So here the conditions may vary a little bit more frequently. Now, what we were told was as the summer goes on, the wind becomes less of a factor and it's more still more often than not. But, we'll kind of see how that plays as we go. But I think that the players have done a great job adjusting, finding a comfort zone. I think for teams that come in, it's probably a little bit harder because, for instance, like Texas, which is here now, they're playing their games in a dome stadium at home. So now they come out and they have to deal with the heat for one of the few times all year for them. And it is an adjustment. And we saw Minnesota and Toronto and Houston come from indoor stadiums or cooler climates, and they had a tough time. Maybe as the summer goes on, it won't be as big an advantage because teams are used to it being hot in the summer. But at least in the early part where teams are coming from, we played 2 months in 60 and 70 degree weather, and now it's 80 something or 90 something and humid. It's a little bit different for them, and hopefully it continues to be an advantage.
Okay, I got to make sure I have this update on the scoreboard with Neil Solondz. All right, the Rays now play outside. The Rangers play inside. You have to remember these things now. It's like college football. Who's in the Big Ten? Who's in, the SEC? That's what it's like. This team, like you said, is 2 games above 500, 31-29. They got Texas. What has been the key for this team where they're playing above 500 right now?
I think first and foremost, it starts with run prevention. It's always going to be pitching and defense first. And I thought this team was pitching okay at the beginning of the year, and now they've become a top 10 pitching team and defending team in Major League Baseball. And I think that will give you a chance to win every day. And then I think beyond that, they've started to get a little bit healthier from a position player perspective. In the first several weeks of the season, the Rays lost 4 outfielders. So they're playing with a lot of guys who would have begun the year at the AAA level. And fortunately, those guys have played quite well and allowed this team to gain its footing while guys come back. The last 2.5 weeks since Josh Lowe came back to the lineup after he had an oblique injury on opening day, the offense has really picked it up. And I think that's what this group is capable of if the core players remain healthy. I think it allows having a more veteran group allows some of the young players like Junior Caminero to really not have as much pressure on him. And I think what we've seen is now that he's had a little less pressure and moved down a spot or 2 in the lineup, he's performed better than he has all year.
Kevin Cash has been the manager there, it feels like, for 30 years. Compared to what happens in baseball, he's been there a long time. When you talk to him, does he kind of give you a thought of, all right, I think we can contend for the division or the wild card? Is there a point in the season he'll start talking that way?
Well, he'll never talk about that on a day-by-day basis. But I think the expectation is going into the year is to make the postseason. I don't think there's any question about that. I think last year was a major disappointment for this group. And a lot of people talk about the challenge of playing, at a temporary facility. But I think that Kevin's feeling was the group was going to be motivated because they didn't make the playoffs more than showing people, hey, we can handle the adversity of a temporary stadium. It was more about how do you handle not making the postseason and finding a way to get back. And they've been without Shane McClanahan, arguably their best starting pitcher to this point of the year, and probably for another chunk of the schedule. And they've more than kept their heads above water. And I'm hoping that the run that they've been on, where they've won approximately 2 of every 3 games over the last couple of weeks, will continue and roll here in June and allow them to put themselves in a postseason position before long.
We're here at Neil Solondz, Tampa Bay Rays radio network here on I believe it's a Wednesday. It's all starting to get blurred here, just like you. Rays going to take on the Rangers. All right, someone asked me this yesterday, so I want to ask you, Mr. Baseball, because you know everything. You're this 24/7. Okay, trade deadline at the end of July. Since we have an expanded playoff, are more teams just going to, at the last minute, all right, we're going to stay put, we're not going to sell? How do you look at it now for a team like the Rays and other teams that are kind of in mid-markets?
I think you have to kind of play a wait-and-see approach, because I think there were all but a handful of teams were within 5 games of a playoff spot as of yesterday or going into today. So, you can go from 5 back to 1 back, or you can go from 5 back to 9 back within a good week or bad week can change your outlook. So I think, there's a handful of teams like probably the Marlins and the Pirates and the White Sox and the Rockies, and maybe even the Orioles at this point. They're starting to play much better, who you could say, okay, they're not going to contend this year. But most of the other teams, they still probably feel they're 1 good week away. Look, I look at Texas, from a talent perspective. I think they have one of the more talented teams in Major League Baseball, yet they're 3 games under 500 as we speak. And I remember Atlanta, which the year they won the World Series, they didn't get over 500 until August. They were hovering around that 500 mark for the entire season, and then all of a sudden they got hot. And, I think the way the postseason is structured, there are some teams that are going to say, you know what, we're 1 good week away. And I think it's probably a tougher decision than ever for someone who heads up baseball operations to determine, do we go for it? Do we sit back and just keep things status quo? Or do we make some moves to better ourselves for now and the future?
The White Sox you bring up won 41 games, one of the worst of all time. Then this year you got Colorado, who you just brought up. I think they have 10 wins, 11. Is this bad for baseball overall, that the worst team is just historically bad like this?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think the greater question is, how long are they going to be in that position? Is this one? Do the White Sox jump from 40 to 60 to 70 wins and start climbing? In the Rockies' case, is this rock bottom? With the year they're having, and only those organizations know what they have beneath and how quickly they can build. I do think it's harder to do what's called, if you want to call it tanking, to hit rock bottom and come up, because the rules now with the draft have changed, where if you're bad for 3 years in a row, really bad, you don't benefit from getting top picks 3 years in a row. You get a first round draft pick, but you're not going to pick in the top 3 years in a row. I think they've discouraged teams from trying to do that. And I think what's impressed me so much about the Rays is they really have never, since they became the Rays from the Devil Rays, they've had sub 500 years. Like last year, they were 2 games under 500, but they've never, they've always been competitive. And I think there's only been one 90 loss season since 2008, which is basically the better parts of almost 2 decades. They've had every sub 500 season. I think they've had They've lost in the 80s. So they've had a chance, and then things haven't worked out, and then they've adjusted accordingly. But they've been by and large a pretty darn competitive team.
I won't lie to you. I was listening to Mad Dog Radio the other day, and they had a Dodgers beat reporter on, and he was complaining about their injuries and they need to upgrade. What? How is this the same sport where the Dodgers are running around and then you have other teams, kind of like the Rays, limited budget, and you're still competitive? How is that allowed? I don't get it, Neil.
Well, I mean, you take advantage of the rules that exist for all teams. I mean, I think the Rays have tried to build a roster where they're 1 through 40 and maybe even 1 through 50. There's not as much of a drop off from player 1 to player 50. I think some organizations, because of what they can do financially, their teams are maybe a little more front loaded, like the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Mets. They're going to have a Soto and Alonso, a Lindor, or a Betts, a Freeman and Ohtani, a Fried and a Judge, where they can pay those guys top dollar. But if they were to lose those guys to injury, yeah, they would have to try and go out and replace them. But it's extremely difficult to replace guys who are, at that stage of the game, at that financial price.
I tell this with my buddies. I want your thoughts. And I appreciate coming on, Neil. We're here with Neil Solondz. If I was the front office, I would not sign a Juan Soto for $700 million. I'd be like, no, this will not help us long term. I get it. Once in a generation talent, he could put up 40 homers. I'm not giving one player $700 million. Is that fair if I do that as a front office?
Well, it depends what position you're in. I don't begrudge any team for going out and saying this is, you're also in that case in the New York market, and the Mets are competing with the Yankees, and they're competing for not only for players, but they're competing for market share. And, there's a lot that goes into it. So I understand, every team's got their own way. The phrase goes, and I used this on a broadcast last night, I think there's many trails to the top of the mountain, but only one top. So what's good for one team is not necessarily good for another. That's kind of one of the beauties of baseball, is that it's not like the NBA, the NHL, and the NFL, where every team is technically on equal footing, and every team is basically doing a similar thing in terms of the way they build their roster to try and win. Within, Major League Baseball rules, you might say there are many different ways of trying to build a winning roster to try and get where you want to go, which is to win a championship. So I think each team has to evaluate their own situation on a personal level and figure out what's best. And, I focus on what the Rays do, and I've been really happy the way this roster has been built and the way the young players are evolving. And I'm really looking forward to the final 2/3 approximately of this season and seeing how things go.
Okay, 2 more for you. I know you're busy. So again, thanks for coming on. 2 fun ones to end with. Number 1, it appears the new Pope is from Illinois, an American, and loves baseball. You, in your career, have you been in the booth with someone who could potentially be the next Pope or someone super famous?
Super famous. I mean, I was fortunate enough to have to have Hank Aaron with me in the booth at the minor league level before he passed, and Tony Gwynn, the same thing. So that, I think Bob Feller too at one point in time. Those were like kind of brushes with, as I came through the minor leagues, folks who had been at that level. Fred McGriff has joined us in the booth, and he's after his Hall of Fame induction when he went into the Rays Hall of Fame. So I guess from a baseball perspective, I've had those brushes with, really unique individuals, and that's a lot of fun. And Evan Longoria is going to be retired as a Ray officially this weekend, so we'll get to see Evan again, which is awesome. He meant so much to this area, not only baseball wise, but community wise. He and his wife Jamie, were wonderful in this community. So I guess I've had a few, but nobody who would be at the level that a Pope is.
Did you ask the crime dog about the Tom Amansky hitting instructional video? I need to know.
I don't know that we brought that video up at that time. He's certainly got his fair share of ribbing and enjoyment out of it. And, I just think he's a really good individual who loves the game. And I know he's been already at a couple games this year in Tampa just because he still lives in the area.
Okay, we'll end with this. Since you did minor league baseball for a long time and you paid your dues, buddy, you were there with multiple teams, including the Durham Bulls. I see a lot of videos lately. You know, they're great. They show the player where he gets the call up to the majors. You as a guy that did play-by-play, is there a moment where you're like, okay, that guy's ready to go to the show? He's clicking. He's do you have that happen to you?
You know, I always figure the front office is the best group to figure out when their team needs that player. I think for instance, when Evan was in Longoria was in Durham, you knew his talents were immense. I mean, you saw moments and glimpses where you're like, wow. I think it was a playoff game he played for us the year before he got the call up, where he hit 2 homers in a game, and they probably were both well over 400 feet. And I was like, okay, this is why this kid is, special. And I remember, similar outings for David Price or James Shields or things of that nature before they got the call to the big leagues. And, I think for me, it was always enjoying and thinking, boy, how good can this guy be in the future? I remember when I was in A-ball, I saw Albert Pujols, his first full season in minor league baseball, on the other side. And I remember a scout that year asking me who was the best player they saw. And I said Albert, and he came up with 5 or 6 other guys that he liked better. And, well, Albert proved a lot of people right.
One time, what's fun is the rehab assignment. And it's sad to say this, that when we used to have the Brevard County Manatees, which was the affiliate of the Brewers here in town. So one time, Jose Fernandez, the guy who tragically passed away with the Marlins, he did a rehab start. I met him and interviewed him. His stuff was so nasty. When you saw it in person, you could not believe. When you saw David Price, was his stuff, I know out of Vandy when he got drafted, was his stuff just electric when you saw him in the minors?
His stuff was special. I'll tell you, I honestly thought before he had Tommy John surgery that Matt Moore had a chance to be the best of all of them. I still remember a game he threw where I think I got home the game was less than 2 hours, and he punched out 14 in 7 innings. And I just thought, wow, this is, and that's why this game is so hard to read, because you just don't know the health factor. It can really change guys. It's like, for instance, why a guy like Drew Rasmussen, I have so much admiration for the work that he's doing right now and how well he's pitching, because he's had not 1, not 2, but 3 elbow procedures. And he's come back and is throwing as well as he ever has in his career. And, it goes to all the people around him who've helped him come back and the support system he has, but obviously he's doing all the work. And, those are the really enjoyable stories to tell during the course of a long season.
I love you saw a guy one day is going to hit, what did Pujols do? Was it 700 or 600? I can't remember now.
7. Yeah.
700 home runs. That's amazing. All right. How can we check out all things with the Audio Network Rays? Is there an app, website? What do we do?
Yeah, if you're tuning into games, that's great. You can catch us on a multitude of ways. I would say raysbaseball.com/radio is a great way to look things up. And, we're on Twitter and on Instagram on @RaysRadio too. So in addition to our individual hashtags and our individual identities on social, but, to catch all of us, that's probably the best way to go.
Neil Solondz, thank you so much for coming out with me, and good luck moving forward this month in June. All right.
Appreciate you having me.